I moved to Willowbrook Gardens thinking I'd found the perfect balance. Close enough to the city for my consulting work, quiet enough for the privacy I needed, and just upscale enough that my neighbors would mind their own business. The townhouse was exactly what I wanted after selling my tech startup, modern, efficient, and positioned at the end of a cul-de-sac where I could work in peace. What I hadn't counted on was Karen Pemberton. Karen lived directly across from me in an identical townhouse, except hers was decorated with enough garden gnomes to populate a small village and flower beds arranged with military precision. She'd been HOA president for 6 years running, a fact she mentioned within the first 5 minutes of our introduction. "Oh, you must be our new resident. I'm Karen Pemberton, HOA president. I do hope you've read through our community guidelines. We maintain very high standards here at Willowbrook Gardens." The problem started 3 weeks after I moved in. I was working late in my home office, which faced Karen's house, when suddenly my entire room blazed with white light. I looked up from my computer to see massive floodlights mounted on Karen's roof, aimed directly at my windows. I figured it was temporary, maybe she was doing some late-night yard work. But the lights stayed on until dawn, then came on again the next night at exactly 10 p.m. After a week of sleeping with blackout curtains and working in what felt like a fishbowl, I walked across the street to have a polite conversation. "Oh, those lights. They're for security purposes. We've had some suspicious activity in the neighborhood lately. I'm sure you understand the importance of keeping our community safe." I asked if she could angle them downward to reduce the glare into my windows. "Well, I suppose I could look into it, but these lights need to provide adequate coverage of my entire property. Perhaps you could invest in some better window treatments?" Her tone made it clear she had no intention of adjusting anything. I thanked her for her time and went home to order more substantial blinds. But Karen wasn't finished. The next week, she installed motion sensor floodlights along her driveway that triggered every time a car passed. Since our townhouses faced each other across a narrow street, any vehicle entering or leaving our cul-de-sac set off a light show that would make a stadium jealous. I tried the HOA complaint process. I filled out the proper forms, cited the community guidelines about reasonable lighting that didn't disturb neighbors, and submitted everything according to the procedures. Karen responded by scheduling a community meeting to discuss the recent complaints from residents who seemed to prioritize their personal comfort over neighborhood security. At the meeting, held in Karen's living room among her collection of ceramic cats, she presented a PowerPoint presentation about crime statistics and the importance of adequate lighting. When I tried to explain that motion sensors didn't need to be bright enough to be seen from space, she cut me off. "I think we can all agree that safety comes first. Those who have nothing to hide shouldn't be concerned about a little extra light." The other residents nodded along. Most of them lived further down the street, where Karen's light show was just an interesting distant glow. 2 months in, Karen upgraded to industrial-grade floodlights with timers. They now turned on at dusk and stayed blazing until dawn, 7 days a week. My electric bill was climbing from running blackout curtains and air conditioning to counter the heat from having mini-suns pointed at my house. I hired a lawyer to review the HOA bylaws and sent Karen a carefully worded letter explaining how her lighting violated multiple community guidelines about considerate neighbor relations and reasonable property modifications. Karen's response arrived the next day via certified mail. She'd filed a complaint against me for attempting to intimidate HOA leadership and creating a hostile environment for community volunteers. She also noted that my lawyer's letterhead indicated I was running a business for my residents, which might violate the community's home occupation restrictions. That's when I realized Karen had done her homework on me. She knew about my consulting business, probably knew about the startup sale, and was testing how far she could push someone with resources to push back. I decided to give her a lesson in what resources actually looked like. My first call was to my former business partner, James, who now ran a commercial real estate development firm. My second was to my lawyer, not the local attorney I'd used for the HOA letter, but Rebecca Chin, who specialized in municipal law and zoning regulations. "You want to do what?" Rebecca asked when I explained my situation. "I want to buy the vacant lot behind Karen's property and develop it according to every legal requirement, while making her floodlight situation absolutely miserable for her instead of me." The vacant lot had been for sale for 8 months. It was an awkward parcel, too small for another townhouse, but zoned for residential development. Most buyers had passed because of the irregular shape and the need for special permits. I bought it for cash in 2 days. Rebecca had discovered something interesting in her research. Willowbrook Gardens had been built in phases, and the lighting requirements in the community guidelines only applied to modifications made to existing structures. New construction fell under county regulations, which had much more flexibility for security and landscape lighting. James recommended an architect who specialized in maximally compliant difficult projects. Within a week, we had plans for a small guest cottage positioned strategically on the lot. But the cottage was just the beginning. The plans included a full security lighting system with motion sensors, timed floods, and pathway illumination. All perfectly legal, all meeting every county requirement, and all positioned to shine directly toward Karen's property. I also added a workshop building, because my consulting business occasionally required space for equipment demonstrations. The workshop needed adequate lighting for safety purposes, naturally. And since the lot sloped down toward Karen's backyard, I included a retaining wall with integrated LED strips for both safety and aesthetic purposes. The LED strips would provide gentle illumination along the wall's entire length, which happened to run directly behind Karen's house. The construction permits went through without a hitch. James knew everyone in the county planning office, and Rebecca had structured everything to exceed every requirement while staying well within my rights as a property owner. Karen noticed the surveying stakes within hours of their installation. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, marching across the street with a folder of what I assumed were HOA regulations. I explained that I had purchased the lot and would be developing it according to all applicable regulations. "You can't just build whatever you want back there. There are community standards. The HOA has to approve any new construction." I handed her a copy of the county permits and Rebecca's legal memo explaining that the HOA's architectural review process didn't apply to separately purchased lots outside the original development. Karen's face went through several interesting color changes as she read. "This is harassment. You're only doing this because of our earlier disagreement." "I'm developing my property according to my needs and all legal requirements," I replied. "I'm sure someone who values proper lighting for security purposes will appreciate having a well-lit neighbor." Construction began the following Monday. I'd hired a crew that specialized in fast residential builds, the kind that could frame a structure in days rather than weeks. Karen spent the first week documenting everything with her phone, taking pictures of workers, equipment, and progress. She filed noise complaints with the county, only to learn that construction during permitted hours was completely legal. She tried to get the city to halt work for permit violations, but every permit was perfectly in order. By the end of the second week, the cottage and workshop were fully framed and roofed. The electricians arrived to begin installing the lighting systems. That's when Karen realized what was coming. The motion sensor floods I was installing were commercial-grade units designed for warehouse security. Completely legal for residential use, rated for harsh weather, and bright enough to illuminate a football field. The workshop lights were industrial fixtures that met OSHA requirements for detailed workspaces. And the LED strips along the retaining wall weren't just decorative pathway lighting. They were architectural accent lights, the kind used to highlight building features on commercial properties. Karen tried one more HOA meeting, but attendance was sparse. Most neighbors were tired of lighting disputes and figured that whatever was being built would eventually be finished and the construction noise would stop. "He's building this specifically to retaliate against me," Karen announced to the 4 residents who showed up. Mrs. Henderson from down the street raised her hand. "Honestly, Karen, your lights have been keeping my grandchildren awake when they visit. Maybe having someone else with bright lights will help you understand the problem." The construction was finished on a Thursday. I spent Friday having the electrical systems tested and timers programmed. The motion sensors were calibrated to trigger on anything larger than a cat within 50 feet of the property lines. Saturday evening at dusk, I activated the full lighting system for the first time. The motion sensor floods were triggered by Karen's own floodlights turning on, creating a feedback loop of blazing illumination. The workshop lights were on a timer matching her scheduled dusk to dawn every night. The LED strips provided a continuous wall of light along her entire back fence. The cottage faced her backyard windows, and I'd positioned landscape spotlights to highlight the architectural features of both buildings, which happened to create additional spillover illumination across her property. But the masterpiece was the workshop's ventilation system. The building code required adequate air circulation for any space that might contain equipment or materials. I'd installed industrial-grade exhaust fans that turned on automatically whenever the lights were active. The fans were perfectly quiet by commercial standards, but they created a constant, low-frequency hum that carried beautifully across the distance to Karen's house. Not loud enough to violate noise ordinances, but persistent enough to be noticed. I watched from my office window as Karen's floodlights turned on at their usual 10 p.m. Immediately, my motion sensors detected the light change and triggered every floodlight on my property. The workshop lights had already been running for an hour, and the LED strips cast everything in a blue-white glow. Karen's backyard was now brighter than most parking lots. She appeared at her back door within minutes, shielding her eyes and looking around in shock. She tried adjusting her floodlights, angling them differently, but every change triggered more motion sensors and created new pools of light. I gave her a week to experience her new lighting situation before making my final move. The next Saturday morning, I had Rebecca deliver an official notice to Karen's address. The lot behind her house was being rezoned for commercial use. I was applying to convert the workshop into a legitimate business facility for my consulting company, which would require extended operating hours and additional security lighting. All completely legal. All properly documented. All perfectly positioned to make Karen's lighting obsession her permanent nightmare. I watched from my office window as Karen opened the certified letter on her front porch. I could see her reading it, flipping through the pages, reading it again. Then she looked up at her floodlights, still blazing away in the afternoon sun, and then toward the back of her property where my buildings rose, like illuminated monuments to her own petty tyranny. Her mouth fell open as she finally understood that every single light she'd installed to annoy me was now permanently triggering a system 10 times brighter pointed directly back at her, and that her beloved HOA rules couldn't save her from the consequences of her own actions.